trying a different angle here on the Morning Pit. I don't know if this looks any better or worse. I feel like it's even more weird because there's lots of nooks and crannies that are sticking themselves into the camera. But, oh well, we're trying a different angle, seeing if it fits a little bit better, or at least a little bit something different to look at. Still got the coffee maker over, that shoulder. But either way, wanted to talk a little defensive ends today. You know, we've talked about some different things this week, the start of a new era in college sports, and Kyle Lewis and his All-America candidacy, and kind of whether he'll live up to the billing this year. And like I say, I think he will. Spoiler alert, I think he will, and we'll probably write about that even more in the 3-2-1 column tomorrow. But I wanted to talk about the defensive ends because I actually wrote a lot about the defensive ends last week. It was defensive end week on Panther-Lair.com. You know, we kind of we're going through our position previews. We timed it out to go 10 weeks ahead of what we anticipate to be the start of training camp. And 1 week dedicated each main position on offense and defense: quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end, O-line, DN, D-tackle, linebacker, corner, safety. And with each position group, we have 5 segments, five parts throughout the week, Monday through Friday, right? It kind of works out nice like that. We have, day 1 is 5 big questions. Day 2 is, comings and goings, like players they lost, players they added. Day 3 is projecting the depth chart. Day 4 is making a prediction about the position group for that season. And day 5 is ranking the top 5 players at that position in the Narduzzi era. So it's fun. It's kind of I think it's an enjoyable way to look at the position. I mean, a lot of the stuff we talk about all year long as it is, but I think it's fun to kind of break it down this way. And so last week I wrote about the defensive ends. Jim's writing about the D tackles this week, but last week I was all focused on the defensive ends, wrote about them a lot. And, I have a lot of thoughts about Jimmy Scott and Nate Matlack and Jaden Moore and Blaine Spires and Joey Zielinski. Those are kind of the main guys I think that are going to be on the field this year and producing for Pitt. Ideally producing for Pitt. We'll find out. But then at the end of the week, we got into ranking the top 5 defensive ends of the Narduzzi era. Kind of went back and did a bunch of research and dug out the legal pad. We got a double side here. Not this part down here. This is comparing Rasheem Biles and Kyle Lewis's stats because I had a little corner there that I wanted to use, but then we did use the back here to rank some other stuff also related to the defensive ends, and so we're going to be referencing those stats here a little bit today. I just wanted to talk about defensive ends under Pat Narduzzi, and I don't know if there's a big question to start with here. I think maybe one of the things I'm most curious about is whether we've overrated the state of the defensive ends under Pat Narduzzi, and whether just the sort of standout performances of a small group of guys makes us feel like this position has been a strength under Pat Narduzzi when maybe it has and maybe it hasn't. And maybe it has. I'm not necessarily saying we've overrated it, but I wonder if we've overrated it. So let's talk about defensive ends today. Let's talk about Pitt's defensive ends this year, but also what we've seen over the course of the 10 years of Pat Narduzzi football, what the defensive end position has produced, whether it's been as good as I think we sort of generally accept it to be or think that it is, and who some of those standout guys have been. Let's talk about defensive ends here on the Thursday edition of the Morning Pit. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's Thursday here on the Morning Pit, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com, hanging out with you for a little bit of Pitt sports talk today. You know what we always say, we always talk about to open the show here. The website, Panther-Lair.com, the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. Pitt football, Pitt basketball, Pitt recruiting, Pitt transfers, Pitt everything. You find it at Panther-Lair.com, and message boards to talk with other Pitt fans all day, every day. Pitt fans are hanging out, talking about Pitt sports at Panther-Lair.com. And then our YouTube channel here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We have lots of Pitt video content for you. We have these daily morning Pitt videos Monday through Friday. We have our weekly live show every Wednesday night. We did it last night at 8:30 p.m. Sometimes we start on time and sometimes we don't, but we do it every Wednesday night at 8:30. Me and Jim Hammett get together to talk a little Pitt sports, and you join the conversation with your comments and questions in the chat screen over on the right, which is always fun. We have a little bit of back and forth. It's like a call-in show. These morning pits here in the morning are like a talk show where I just talk to you for a little while, and then the Wednesday night show and our post-game shows are the same way, are like a call-in show. You can get in the chat and put your comments and questions, and we react and have a little conversation. So make sure you tune in for that. And if you want to make sure you never miss one of our live shows, either the weekly live show or our post-game shows or anything like that, you can always subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. You turn on notifications, and then you get an alert sent to your phone whenever we go live or have anything going on here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Also, don't forget to get your questions in for this week's mailbag. We are taking questions on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com. It's on the Between Fifth and Forbes message board. There's a thread there. You can put your questions in that thread, and we will answer as many as we can in tomorrow's Morning Pit. So I always look forward to doing that. Those are always fun, and hopefully you can participate as well. All right, defensive ends at Pitt. When I say the defensive ends at Pitt under Pat Narduzzi, what do you think of? Like, is it a positive? Is it a negative? And I'm talking about overall, like the whole era, not just right now. You know, I mean, we can talk about the current roster, and we will talk about the current roster. But when you think about the era of Pat Narduzzi, 2015 to present, what do you think about with defensive ends? My guess is you probably have a bit of a roller coaster impression that, you know, kind of, you know, wasn't great early on and then sort of peaked around 2019, 2020, tailed off since then. And I don't think that's entirely inaccurate. You know, highlighted by a handful of individual performances, that's more or less the trend that it took. And so I looked at the numbers because I was ranking the top 5 defensive ends of the Narduzzi era. And I went back and looked at the numbers. And obviously, I mean, Juan Price is at the top of the list statistically. I didn't put Juan Price as my number 1 defensive end of the Narduzzi era, but he's at the top of the list statistically. 24.5 sacks just in the 2 years that he played for Pat Narduzzi, 2015 and 2016. 24.5 sacks, 42.5 tackles for loss. 2016, he had 13 sacks and 23 tackles for loss. No defensive end under Pat Narduzzi has matched those numbers or really even come close. The closest to those numbers was Juan Price in 2015, when he had 11.5 sacks and 19.5 tackles for loss. So it's kind of Juan Price and everybody else statistically, but when I ranked the top 5 ends of the Narduzzi era, I didn't put Juan Price number 1. I don't even know if I put him number 2, actually. I think I actually put him number 3, behind Patrick Jones and Rashad Weaver. And there are a few reasons for that. One, and this isn't fair to Juan Price at all. It's not fair to him. But in 2016, when he had 13 sacks and 23 tackles for loss, that was part of, historically, one of the worst Pitt defenses ever. I mean, like, the pass defense was so bad that year. They ranked really high in terms of rush defense. They were good against the run. But, man alive, did they get torched in the passing game. And we know that. I mean, we watched all those games, the Carolina game, the Oklahoma State game, the Virginia Tech game. Those were particularly egregious. I mean, there were some brutal... I mean, the Clemson game that they won, they still gave up like 600 yards to Deshaun Watson. I mean, like, it was historically bad. And I shouldn't hold that against Juan Price, but there is something to be said for the fact that, like, okay, you had 13 sacks and 23 tackles for loss, and the pass defense was still god-awful. Like, that doesn't compute. If you get that kind of production from one player, particularly a pass rusher, you know, it stands to reason that the pass defense overall is going to be really, really good, and it wasn't. And so why do I hold that against Juan Price? Well, it sort of makes me feel like you had all these stats, but it maybe didn't have that big of an impact. I also think, and, you know, I've heard just over the years that Juan Price wasn't necessarily the most consistent player, didn't always stick to his assignments, made a lot of big splash plays, but also wasn't doing everything he needed to do in terms of defensive responsibilities and containment and that kind of thing. And so I hold that against him a little bit. Really, statistically and otherwise, 2020 stands out as one of the best seasons at Pitt for the defensive end position, certainly under Pat Narduzzi, and maybe on a longer timeline than that. That year, Rashad Weaver and Patrick Jones were pretty unstoppable. Between the two of them, they had 16.5 sacks and 27.5 tackles for loss. Now, those numbers are only a little more than what Juan Price did by himself in 2016. Never mind that they played 2 fewer games in 2020 than they played in 2016. But Patrick Jones and Rashad Weaver were really outstanding players in 2020. And they were named All-Americans, consensus All-Americans as a result. And I don't think that's just, well, there weren't any other good defensive ends or anything like that. Those guys were both really, really good. And they got the recognition that they deserved by being named All-Americans. And when you when you look at total sack numbers over the course of the Narduzzi era, it's Juan Price is number one with 24.5, and then you get Patrick Jones with 22 and Rashad Weaver with 17. I mean, those are the top three statistically defensive ends in the Narduzzi era, and I put those three guys in my top three of the rankings, just not necessarily in that order. Weaver had basically 3 active seasons. He was in that 2016 class, played in 17, 18, and 20. He got hurt and missed the 2019 season. Jones, similar situation, played 4 active seasons, 48 games, as opposed to Weaver played, 48 games. Weaver played less than that. I forget what Weaver's total number ended up being. But those guys, played a few more seasons under Pat Narduzzi than Juan Price did. Price only played 2. Those guys had 3 and 4 seasons. Both came in that 2016 recruiting class as some of the least heralded guys in that class. They were both 2-star recruits, Rashad Weaver and Patrick Jones, as many people remember. And they ended up probably being the best and most productive and most decorated and successful players from that recruiting class. I don't think there's anybody else from that 2016 class who can say they had as productive or, successful seasons or careers, I should say, as Rashad Weaver and Patrick Jones. And that includes Damar Hamlin and it was a star-studded class, but those guys were really the biggest ones to come out of it. And so those are your top 3 defensive ends. Now, what's interesting after that is when I ranked the top 5, all right, so I had, Patrick Jones, Rashad Weaver, Juan Price. Like, okay, yeah, those guys all had big numbers, but who's after that? Like, if I just asked you off the top of your head, all right, who are the best DNs of the Narduzzi era? You say, well, Price, Weaver, Jones. Okay, then what? And this is where I think the thought started occurring to me that maybe, defensive ends under Pat Narduzzi have been okay and had a few sort of really standout guys, but maybe not as star-studded as we sometimes think that it was. Because I think it gets really tricky. Because after Weaver, Jones, and Price, in whatever order you want to set them, coming up with number 4 is kind of tricky. I went with Haba Baldonado. He had 15 sacks, really over the course of 2 active seasons, 2019 and 2021. He had 9 sacks in 2021, 12 tackles for loss. Pretty good performance there. He ends up with actually the 5th most sacks of any defensive end under Pat Narduzzi over the last 10 years with his 15 sacks and 22.5 tackles for loss total over the course of his career. He had a little bit of production here and there in 2020, 2000, and in 2018, because but he was limited by injuries and things like that. But I mean, Baldonado was fine. He had 9 sacks in 14 games in 2021. He was one of the top pass rushers. Obviously, Kalijah Kancey was a big-time pass rusher on that team, and even more so the next year. Haba Baldonado was fine. He was good, but I don't know if he ever quite reached the potential that everybody believed he had, and I believed he had, and I don't think we were wrong about his potential. I think injuries slowed him down. And then number 5, who do you pick after that? Who even comes to mind? Like, I could throw a bunch of names out there. John Morgan, Deion Hayes, Sam Okunlola. Do any of those guys, Dwayne Hendricks, do you remember Dwayne Hendricks? And even the guys this past year, Jimmy Scott and Nate Matlack, do any of those guys jump off the page and be like, yeah, that's a top 5 defensive end of the last 10 years? So I ended up with Deslin Alexandra, who had 16.5 sacks when he played like 6 years at Pitt. He had 29.5 tackles for loss. He had the 4th most sacks by a defensive end under Pat Narduzzi, behind only Weaver, Jones, and Price. I guess in order it'd be Price, Jones, and Weaver. But he also played like more seasons than he played 3 times as many seasons under Pat Narduzzi as Juan Price did, and ended up with, 8 fewer sacks and 13 fewer tackles for loss. But so this is my point, and it's no disrespect to Haba Baldonado or Desmond Alexander, but there's a bit of a drop-off there. And I think it's rather considerable, actually, after Weaver Jones-Price and then to everybody else. Deion Hayes never really came into his own and had the big seasons he was expected to have. He played at Pitt for, 4 seasons? And he ended up with 12 sacks and 25 and a half tackles for loss, which is not bad, but he was active every year. He played as a true freshman. Sam Okunlola could have, maybe, 2023, he had 5 sacks and 6 tackles for loss. Maybe, the arrow was pointing up there. I think he eventually could have been another good one, but he left and transferred to Colorado before that could ever really happen. Jimmy Scott's got 6 sacks, which puts him relatively high on the list. He's not that far, and that's really his first real production, his first real active season where he was playing contributing minutes and contributing snaps, a significant amount of snaps. So maybe he could potentially get there. But you really run out of options pretty quick. And you get from those guys who were really good, who put up either crazy numbers like Price or were All-Americans like Weaver and Jones, to guys who were just, pretty good, solid guys, good guys to have on the roster. And then you run out of them pretty quick because it's pretty much Baldonado and Alexandra, and then you're just in guys who either never really did much or fell short of expectations or were needed to do more and didn't, or transferred too early, or And so it's interesting because, again, I went into the whole thing with the perception of, defensive ends have just been a real strength under Narduzzi. Have they? There have been 13 times in the last 10 seasons when a defensive end has recorded at least 5 sacks. This is what was on the back of the legal pad. These are all the seasons where a defensive end recorded at least 5 sacks under Pat Narduzzi. 13. 8 of them, 4 times there were multiple in the same season. So 2019, Jones and Alexandra both had 5+ sacks. 2020, Jones and Weaver both had 5+ sacks. 2021, Baldonado and John Morgan had 5+ sacks each. 2024, this past season, Jimmy Scott had 6 and Nate Matlack had 5. So that's 8 of those instances of 5+ sacks for a defensive end out of the last 10 years. And they all kind of happen in those 4 seasons. It feels to me like there should be more times, if defensive end is really a strength and has really turned out the level of talent that we think it has, there should be more instances of 5+ sacks from defensive ends than there are. And you have a lot of guys who just barely scraped by. Nate Matlack barely had 5 sacks last year. Sam Okunlola had 5 sacks in 2023. Morgan and Alexandra, Morgan had 5.5 in 2021. Alexander had 5.5 in 2019 and 2022. It's just not a lot of production. And the production has dropped, arguably not as low as it's ever been this past season. The defensive ends this past year had 15.5 sacks, which is actually more than 2023. They only had 13.5 that year. And in 2022, they had 14.5. Some of these years, Pitt was able to get sack production from other positions. 2022, Kalijah Cansey had a huge year. This past year, Kyle Lewis and Rasheem Biles kind of made up the difference on the sacks. So the defensive ends, it wasn't okay that they didn't produce, but you were able to get that production from elsewhere. But Pitt's defense at its best is when the defensive ends are producing. I think you would probably say, what were Pat Narduzzi's best defenses at Pitt? 2019 and 2020 are what I would point to. In each of those years, they had multiple guys putting up a lot of sacks. 2020, Patrick Jones had 9 sacks and Rashad Weaver had 7.5. In 2019, Jones had 8.5 and Desmond Alexander had 5.5. You had production coming from the defensive end position, not just one guy going off like it was in 2015 and 2016 with Juan Price, but consistent production from multiple players. And so you were able to kind of get by these last couple years, 2022 and 2024, because you were getting that sack production from elsewhere. But for Pitt's defense to really be at its best, the defensive ends have to step up and produce. And they haven't really done that basically since 2021, when, John Morgan had 5.5 sacks and Haba Baldonado had 9. And so that's the kind of year you need this season. You need to go over 15.5 sacks. You need to get, I forget what I predicted. I'm trying to. I made a prediction last week that Pitt would get more sacks from the defensive ends than they got last year, but I guess I didn't put a specific number on it. I don't know where they need to be, but it needs to be above 15.5. It needs to be closer to 20, if not higher, out of the defensive ends, because that production just wasn't there last year. Can it be there this year? Well, you're going to need Jimmy Scott to take a step forward, and you're going to need these transfers, particularly Jaden Moore, Blaine Spires. Like, those guys need to step up and have a big season. You're going to be relying on them. Maybe some of the young players like a Maverick Grazio or somebody can make an impact, but particularly after losing Sincere Edwards to the transfer portal, you're going to need the transfers who came in to produce. I think Jaden Moore can be really good. He's probably the one I'm circling the most, but Jimmy Scott's got to take a step forward. He had 6 sacks last year. He needs to be more like 7.5, 8.5, 9, 9.5 in 2025. We'll see if he can. I don't know if he can. I think he's got the ability, but we'll see if he can put it all together. All right, don't forget we have the mailbag tomorrow, so get your questions in now on the Between Fifth and Forbes message board at Panther-Lair.com, and that way we can answer as many questions as possible in the mailbag. Look forward to that as always. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We'll be back with you tomorrow for the Morning Pitt mailbag right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.